This is the Books Podcast presented by Tim Hague.
All we need to do is figure out the right ideas and then put them into practice. That just isn't true. We have not chosen 30 thinkers because we think they're the ones who got things the most right.
I ask you, gentlemen of the jury, is this the kind of book you'd like your wives and servants to read?
How to Think Politically by Graeme, Garrard and James Bernard Murphy. Well, that's two authors, of whom we've got one here at the moment. Graeme is joining us on Skype. Graeme, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure to be here.
Right, so the book is called How to Think Politically. And that's, I wanted to say first, that's not a manual, is it? It's more a tour d'horizon than a how-to. It's not a sort of practical guide.
No, it's not. You're right about that.
So normally at this point I'd do a quick stand first and saying this is the kind of book it is, but I'm actually going to invite you to do that. Tell me about the book and what kind of book it is then.
Right. Well, it's aimed at general readers who don't necessarily have any background in politics or haven't necessarily studied it formally or anything like that. It's not an academic book, although it deals with some academics and some academic topics. It's aimed really at people who just have a general interest in politics. So it's meant to be accessible, and it's written in that manner. I
think it is accessible. Essentially, it's more or less 30 shortish chapters about 30 different thinkers who've contributed to the ways that we think about political action and political behaviour. So yes, it sort of does give you a nice wide playing field, doesn't it?
Yeah, it covers a really, really broad range in a fairly superficial way, but I think that's a good thing in a book like this. So yeah, it starts with Confucius, 2,500 years ago, and comes right up to the present, and covers thinkers in China, in Africa, in North America, Europe, India. So it really does range very broadly. But the idea of doing that is that we're trying to combat a certain conception of politics which has taken hold. You might call this the House of Cards view, the sort of very cynical view, the sort of Frank Underwood or Francis Urquhart view, that politics is only about power and it's a kind of game, some brutal game of positioning and status and power. Of course, all of that is true, but it isn't the whole truth. And we had the idea that the way in which politics is discussed, the language that's used, the way in which it's conceptualized nowadays, particularly, is kind of debased. It's missing a lot out. And so we thought by turning to these exemplary thinkers, we could try and show the readers that there's another way to talk about politics rather than just as power and position. And that's in terms of ideas. We make a distinction in the introduction between might and right, between power and justice. And we tried to show in the beginning, in the introduction, that politics, to really understand politics, you really need to encompass both. And that the bit that we want to focus on by looking at these thinkers is the second of those. It's concepts of justice, it's ideas, it's all those sorts of things, which tend not really to play any role or much of a role now in political debate, in discussions about politics. So that was part of our reason.
Absolutely. I made a note in the margin that you're optimists. You're actually interested in how thinkers have improved the world, which sort of addresses that, dealing with the current debased elements of politics.
Yes, that's very true. The part of what what I call the House of Cards view of politics leaves out is the role that ideas play in politics, and you only have to look at history to see so many examples of that. Now, you say we're optimists. Well, That depends. I mean, ideas don't always have good consequences. Our point is that they have consequences, good and bad, and that you have an impoverished idea of politics if you ignore that. So let me give you a couple of very quick examples. Karl Marx. If it weren't for Karl Marx, there wouldn't be a Vladimir Lenin, at least not as he became. And without Vladimir Lenin, the Russian Revolution would have been, there either wouldn't have been one or there would have been a very different outcome, let's put it that way. And but for that, the 20th century would have been completely different. So there's an example of how the ideas of one thinker, Karl Marx, really did have a very huge impact on the whole shape of the 20th century, which would look different.
So that's one side of an equation. But you're also quite interested. I read the whole book, so I also know that you chaps are quite interested in how far abstract thinking can be. How far it can be removed from experience. You make a contrast between people who live, quiet lives like Immanuel Kant, and those who experience upheavals like Thomas Hobbes, Tom Paine, and there is a question how much their experience contributed to their philosophical outlook, because it's not some ivory tower abstraction for everybody.
No. That's true. I mean, most of those thinkers, of the 30 thinkers, a really small proportion were academics, even though these ideas now tend to be studied and taught by academics. They're not. Very few of them were themselves academics. I mean, there were just a few exceptions. Nietzsche was a professor. Hegel was a professor. Karl Marx was not. Most of them were led active lives, either in politics, like say Machiavelli, or were political activists like, say, Karl Marx, or intellectuals, but not actually academics. And I think that's important. I do think it shapes and colors their experiences and is reflected in their ideas to some degree.
Well, it takes us back to Plato and Aristotle, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Of the philosopher king, whether it is practical to bring, or who ought to be in charge. There's this division that you make between, not you, Aristotle makes between intellectual virtue, which is reason, and practical virtue, politics. And for liberals like me, there's a slight cognitive dissonance. If things are true, if you can be correct about things, we ought to be able to govern that way. And yet, when people bring that as their governing principle, you get the French Revolution, or very possibly Jeremy Corbyn. I guess we'll see. But disaster can arise from believing that you've got the truth of the human condition.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you said that, because we don't want people to come away from the book thinking that, all we need to do is figure out the right ideas and then put them into practice and good things will follow. There's so much evidence that just isn't true. That doesn't happen. Very often, we even say this explicitly, that ideas often have unintended consequences and perverse effects. And therefore, one has to be very careful as well. So you're right. Aristotle identified a particular faculty, which he called, the Greek word is phronesis, which usually is translated as practical wisdom or practical judgment. It's the ability to reason well about practical matters, to have what's sometimes called the sense of reality. So that's really important, and Aristotle used this as a criticism of his teacher Plato, because he says, we want rulers who are men and women of ideas, yes, but also have this faculty, this ability to relate the abstract with the particular, the universal and general with the specific, and come up with solutions and prescriptions that are practicable. And if you lose sight of that, well, disaster can ensue.
Well, I thought that was essentially your big theme. One has to tease it out. You don't hit us over the head with it, but essentially the big theme is the middle way, isn't it? It's the being prepared to entertain both sides of the argument that is the acme of ambition.
I think so. I mean, we used at the end in the conclusion we made the reference to the metaphor of the porcupines. You know,
Yes.
they need to find that optimal distance from each other, where they get the best of both. A little too close and a little too far is going to potentially have disastrous consequences. So a lot of political philosophy is trying to find just that balance between ideas and practice, between universal and particular. And it's not easy, obviously. If it was, there would be a lot more agreement. But you may have noticed over these 30 thinkers, there isn't a lot of agreement on where that balance is. So it's not easy. But I think at least understanding that that's what one should aim for. So our basic idea is that politics now, as it's practiced and particularly as it's discussed now, is unbalanced. It has not found that equilibrium, and that maybe, perhaps this is the optimism you referred to, maybe by injecting a little bit of some ideas into this, maybe we can rebalance it a bit and elevate it a bit. Not that I think we want to, reconstruct the political world according to abstract theories, but simply inject perhaps a touch more idealism and theory into the discussion of everyday politics.
Well, you mentioned your 30 thinkers there, and so far we've mentioned one or two of them. We're not going to do a list, but you do note that, you say 100 years ago, your list wouldn't have included, for instance, Confucius, Al-Farabi, Maimonides, who are among your chapters. Now, why is that? Is that just fashion, or is it a touch, of PC, of political correctness coming in, that we now need to draw in an African and a couple more women and an Asian or two to balance out the Eurocentric expectations?
Yeah, I mean, every period will have its own thinkers that it privileges, that speak to it more than others. For example, in his lifetime, Friedrich Nietzsche was virtually unknown, and yet now, almost everyone's heard of Nietzsche, and you can go into an airport bookshop and buy books by Nietzsche now. He had to publish some of his own books. He had to pay for the publication of them himself. They sold so poorly. And
he was contemptuous of bestsellers as well, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. That's right. He'd be horrified now if he could see how popular he was. So there's an example of how tastes change, values change, and issues change. And some thinkers express ideas that don't resonate with their own times, but do with ours, and vice versa. So I just think there's a sort of element of relativism here that cultures are diverse and periods change and tastes change. There's a lot of that. I mean, look at Karl Marx. He too was virtually unknown in his own lifetime, and died in relative obscurity, and yet, not that long later, a couple of decades into the 20th century, and he's one of the most important and consequential thinkers in history.
Most important and consequential, but not necessarily one of the most right.
That's right. So we have not chosen a list of 30 thinkers because we think they're the ones who got things the most right.
Oh, well, actually, let me ask you about one of the recent ones, because you've got divided them into historical and contemporaries. You've got Martha Nussbaum there. Really, is she genuinely of the first rank? Would 100 years from now, will she be in this book?
Well, the last question I can't answer because I don't know. As for her, well, she is an important voice in a particular from a particular point of view that we wanted to represent. And as I said, this list is highly contentious. Aspects of it aren't. All lists would include some of these thinkers, but not all lists would include all of these thinkers. I do want to leave the impression to your listeners that this is our list, and it's not definitive. It's certainly not exhaustive, and other people would have other lists.
Well, where she does fit in, actually, come to think of it, now you say that, is that she, like so many of these thinkers, is quite interested in telling us how we ought to live, and what constitutes, happiness, or what the purpose of human life is. And we're going back to Plato and Aristotle, of people who wanted to explain to us what we ought to understand by happiness. And it's not always what we think happiness is. It's not happy thoughts always.
No. Well, and there are some thinkers like Nietzsche who thought happiness was not a good that we should pursue. And against that is Nussbaum. Yes, her inspiration is Aristotle, I think, ultimately, and she wants to restore a universal idea or conception of human well-being. But that's highly controversial because we live in a skeptical age where people are reluctant to assert with the confidence that, say, Aristotle had, that there is a particular way to lead a good life. And so that would explain... Oh,
and also the idea that the good life is the same thing for everybody.
Exactly.
A lot of these thinkers are pretty sure they know better than the rest of us.
Yes, absolutely. So one of my particular favorites is David Hume, the Scottish philosopher David Hume.
I'm a fan of Hume as well.
And he was his skepticism is refreshing, I find, amongst so many thinkers who were so confident, so damn sure of themselves. I think that's one reason why Hume is still popular, perhaps more so than some other thinkers.
Well, he's congenial as well, isn't he?
Yes.
He's not Kant. He's not Immanuel Kant, who's very austere and very very clear and unbending.
Yeah, they're almost opposites in that respect. Kant was a moral absolutist. Yeah, and his personal habits and lifestyle were very quite puritanical. But that said, I mean, Kant is very, very popular and influential in our time, particularly among liberals, because he was been appropriated by liberal thinkers. Whether he would call himself a liberal, I don't know, but the word didn't really come into use until afterwards. But I mean, that is a notable feature of these thinkers. Most of them is just how sure they were, and putting them next to each other in all 30 of them next to each other, all so confident and yet all disagreeing, may itself, I think, be a statement of some kind that, we shouldn't be so damn sure. Because, here they all are insisting that they're right when they can't all be right. They might all be wrong, but they can't all be right.
Yeah. Good point. Can I try a couple more on you?
Sure.
Mao Zedong, did he contribute anything distinctive to the debate? And also, I wanted to Mohandas Gandhi. Wasn't he more a sort of political strategist than a system builder?
Right. Well, it's true. I mean, Mao situated himself within a tradition of thought, that of Marxism-Leninism, and so it's his views, his political views are persuasive largely to the degree that you accept that his Marxism-Leninism. That depends on who the readers are. But there's his significance in the history of the 20th century, I think, merits his inclusion. If for no other reason, he shows how ideas do have consequences, how ideas can really change the world.
Well, yeah, so does Hitler, but you haven't put him in as a thinker.
No, that's true. I think that Mao had a clear political theory and had developed some of his own ideas, unlike Hitler.
Okay.
Hitler had a sort of hodgepodge of crazy ideas.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Mao was a serious thinker in his own right, a serious theorist in his own right. That may have been a bad thing in in terms of practical consequences. But I think he deserves consideration on the merits of himself as a thinker and an actor in politics.
To get away with from the individuals, I'm going to finally, if I may, I'm going to quote a sentence that you write and ask you to develop that one for us. Politics as a way to manage human societies by means of argument rather than force arose relatively recently in human history and may well disappear in the future. What do you mean by that?
Right. Well, it's a particular conception of politics which we're endorsing, which is that politics is about argument and language and discourse. Not everyone accepts that. So our view is that when fighting starts, when people start shooting, as it were, then politics is over and you're into war. You're into conflict. Now, not everyone accepts that view. That's debated. So you may know the famous remark by Karl von Clausewitz, the German Prussian theorist of war, who famously said that war is politics by other means. Yeah. So that's a different conception. That's a view where war is part of politics. So we're arguing that politics is separate from war, from open conflict. This is more in line, you might say, with the ancient Greeks, who put a lot of emphasis, particularly in ancient Athens, on politics as discursive and about argument, about debate, about persuading people to your view.
But isn't that a conception of politics that's only going to work in a tiny state like Athens?
No, it's a conception of politics that works really in almost all contexts, where people aren't using physical force to coerce others to their position. We say that's not politics, that's war. For example, during the English Civil War, Parliament was in conflict with the Crown. And it was back and forth, and there were debates and arguments, and there was all kinds of maneuverings. But at some point, they crossed the threshold, and that all stopped, and you had war. And that's when politics is over, and then you resort to another means. So our point is that that conception of politics is fairly recent in human history, by which we mean in the last, say, 2,500 years or so.
Yeah.
It's distinct from what goes on in other forms of life.
We mentioned the French Revolution earlier on. Which category do you put that in?
Well, I would have to say
it's a tricky one, isn't it?
It is. It's more tricky, that's for sure. I would say that it because it covered such a long period of time and it wasn't continuous fighting. But I would say the revolution itself was the end of politics. Uh-huh. And when politics was resumed, when the National Assembly was reconstituted, then you had the restoration of politics. Of course. There were different phases and periods, and there was fighting, etc. But I don't think it contradicts the idea that politics, politics is essentially about persuading other people, not necessarily in a gentlemanly way in a parliament, etc., but using language. Now, language can cover a range of things. It can be, a rational debate back and forth, but can also be manipulation, it can be propaganda, it can be rhetoric. There's a whole range of techniques that you can use in language to try and get the other person to go along with what you want. That's all political. Our point is simply that when that stops and physical force is used, then that's not really politics, that's war.
Well, that's very interesting. And the book is also very interesting. It's How to Think Politically by Graeme, Garrard and James Bernard Murphy. We've been talking to Graeme from Bloomsbury, and it's £14. Thank you very much.
My pleasure indeed.
That was the Books Podcast with Tim Haig. The Books Podcast is produced by Green Shoot. You can find out more at www.green-shoot.com, and Tim can be contacted on tim@green-shoot.com.